Thanks everyone for attending tonight. We're really excited to have Cait presenting in regards to CWD. This, I think, marks probably our second year, the beginning of our second year of our conservation webinar series, where we bring guests in who are knowledgeable about subjects that are important to conservation, to hunters and anglers, and to members of the public who have an interest in the sustainability of wildlife and other issues. So thanks, Cait, for coming on. Format is the usual. Cait says 30 to 40 minutes if she sticks to the script, and then we'll go into Q&A. You can ask your questions in the Q&A box on Zoom, and you can just put them in the comments on Facebook. If you have questions there, we'll get to the questions at the end. As always, your questions, if they're directed at Cait, it's more about policy and how we're going to manage or look at managing CWD and how we're going to react. She is not a statutory decision maker or a minister yet, so she can't necessarily answer all of those political questions, but just keep that in mind, that the questions for her need to be kind of more technical in nature as it relates to CWD or how we'll handle it or the impacts on wildlife or people. So thanks for attending. I'll just give Cait a very quick introduction. This is her second time with us. I think she gave us an update last year. So Cait's a health biologist with the Ministry of Forests. She joined the BC Wildlife Health Program in 2006 and now leads priority disease monitoring programs such as chronic wasting disease and bovine tuberculosis. Cait's dedicated to working with researchers, agencies, stakeholders, First Nations, and the general public to ensure that these groups have access to current and accurate facts on priority wildlife health issues in BC. So with that, Cait, I think I'm just going to hand things over to you, and I'll take care of all the stuff in the Q&A and all the questions. And yeah, feel free. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jesse. Thanks for having me. I'm going to share my screen here. How's that looking?
Looks perfect.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, really appreciate the opportunity to share this information. So thanks to Jesse and the BC Wildlife Federation for the invitation. Yeah, I've got some updates. Obviously, chronic wasting disease is a really big priority for us in BC. And so, yeah, I'll just dive right in. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit, share a little background. I'm sure folks are more or less familiar with CWD, but I'll just give a brief background, talk a little bit about what we're doing about the CWD situation, and then I'll go over some of our proposed response and management plans. We've recently updated our CWD plan for BC, which includes some of that information. So I'll give you that update, and then hopefully end off on an optimistic note of how we can stay ahead of this. So just briefly, I'm going to go through a little background information. Chronic wasting disease is an infectious neurological disease of the deer family. So in nature, we've seen it affect deer, elk, and moose, as well as reindeer in Europe. So we believe it could impact caribou here in North America. The disease is 100% fatal for animals that become infected. There's still no treatment or vaccine. And this disease does not discriminate. A healthy fat buck is just as vulnerable as the old and weak animals on the landscape. CWD is a prion disease. It's caused by an abnormal protein called a prion, and it is not a naturally occurring disease agent on the landscape. What I mean by this is that it's not like other pathogens like bacteria or viruses that have been on the landscape for a long time. We see disease outbreaks with these other pathogens, and populations may even decline, but they're typically given a chance to recover after these types of outbreaks. But that's not the case with CWD. With CWD, the cases just continue to increase. There's a number of factors that make this disease very difficult to detect and manage on the landscape. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. One of the reasons why it's so difficult to detect is that most animals that are infected with CWD appear perfectly healthy. We call these silent carriers because there's no indication that those animals are sick. No canary in the coal mine, so to speak. So we rarely see sick animals in the wild, even in places, in eastern Alberta where they have over 50% of the deer are infected. We just don't see sick animals on the landscape. It takes over 18 months for symptoms to show. And what we think is happening in places like Alberta is that infected animals are being taken out by predators before humans would be able to recognize those symptoms. So if an animal is sort of in a situation where they've progressed to the later stages of the disease, usually we only see this in like a research setting. That's when we start to see the excessive weight loss, neurological signs like poor coordination and drooling. Those are kind of the classic late stage CWD symptoms. Although infected animals don't look sick, they are passing this disease agent to other animals, and they're also shedding the disease agent or the prion into the environment. So this environmental contamination potential of CWD makes it extremely difficult to manage and almost impossible to eradicate once it's in the environment. Infected animals will shed the prion through bodily fluids or through carcasses that decompose on the land. These prions are then resistant to disinfectants or burning and will remain in the soil, in the water, on plants for several years, ready to infect other animals that pass through. There's also a potential human health element here. So I'm not a human health expert, but I work closely with public health colleagues in trying to understand these risks and frame that message for the public that are concerned about it. So what the public health folks say is that there has never been a documented case of CWD in humans, but there has been some research findings that have been inconclusive. So they recommend a precautionary approach and say that CWD positive animals should not be eaten. So what's at risk? Because CWD is 100% fatal in infected animals, we know that long-term, populations are going to decline. But even before the number of animals on the land start to decline, we see shifts in the population demographics, changing to or shifting to fewer older animals on the landscape. And we've seen this in Alberta with a decline in mature mule deer bucks in the eastern parts of Alberta. So even before we start to see fewer animals on the landscape, we see that demographic change in the populations. And even before that happens, these conservation kind of level impacts, we see immediate impacts to people and communities after CWD is detected in an area. We see hunters change behavior following a CWD introduction, whether they change where they hunt or they feel less comfortable sharing meat with their family. There's also, kind of trickling impacts on wildlife related businesses. And, maybe most concerning is whether the human health risk is real or perceived. Any barriers to accessing healthy game meat presents a risk to food security as well. So everything that we're learning about CWD and how management is playing out in other places, it's becoming very clear that hunting is the most important tool for managing CWD. Harvest management has been shown to be effective in keeping CWD in check in certain areas. This obviously requires collaboration with the hunting community and hunting organizations right from the beginning, right from when even before you get that first detection. We're very lucky in BC that we have a solid partnership with the BC Wildlife Federation and other groups in our CWD effort. Hunters also play a really important role in that hunters provide 80%, over 80% of the samples that we receive for CWD testing. So this is supporting science-based decisions around this disease, both pre and post detection. Without these samples, we would be flying blind, without the information we need to make smart decisions. Or we would have to go out and kill and remove more animals just to be able to test them and get the information that we need for health surveillance. We don't want to do this, and thankfully we don't have to, because we are working with hunters, and hunters have been amazing in providing those samples, but we still need more samples. We certainly aren't testing enough animals in BC. So the next couple of maps are just to show where CWD is in North America currently. This is a map produced by the US Geological Survey. The gray areas are free-ranging surveyed populations, and then the yellow and red dots are captive surveyed populations or farms. The first map is from 2018, just to demonstrate how much the situation has changed over the last 5 years. So skipping ahead to today, I'll just do that a couple times, just to see that sort of, in my mind, dramatic expansion of the disease distribution, particularly in the prairies. So we've been watching this disease track across southern Alberta. It then jumped the Rocky Mountains in 2019, is now in Montana and Idaho. And new just this month is a new detection in an elk farm in northern Alberta. That's that red dot up in northern Alberta there. And this is significant because it's pretty far outside the known CWD area in southern Alberta. And there's been very little surveillance in wildlife in that area. So we don't yet know how that's going to play out, potentially creating a significant increased risk for our, northern parts of Northeast BC. So the cases closest to Southeast BC, around the Kootenay region, are well within the range of natural animal movement. And we have collar data that shows animals moving back and forth from those CWD affected areas. So for this reason, Southeast BC is considered the highest risk area. But because CWD could also come in on a carcass or contaminated hay, we appreciate that every corner of BC is at risk. And so we need to make sure that we're looking for it everywhere. So current situation for BC, thankfully CWD has not yet been detected in BC. However, the confidence in our disease status is low because we're just not testing enough animals to be sure that it's not here. That first detection in BC could really happen any day. Best case scenario is it will happen in the areas where we're doing the most testing, down in Southeast BC and the mandatory testing zones, where we have been testing a lot of animals, and we've been working really closely with the community down there on response planning. If it's detected up in the Caribou or on Vancouver Island, where we are not doing enough testing, then chances are it will have been there for some time, and there's not much that we're going to be able to do in that case. So preventative measures, preventing human import of CWD material, and testing to make sure that we catch it early are all really critical right now. There's two main ways that CWD will enter BC. Natural animal movement, which we know is a highest risk in Southeast BC. Not much that we can do to prevent animals crossing the border, but we are studying animal movement so that we can better predict the entry points and focusing testing in those areas. The other way that CWD could come into BC is through human import. Human import of a carcass harvested in a CWD area, or contaminated hay, or contaminated biological material like urine-based scents. So that human import means that all areas of BC are at risk right now. We know that there are lots of carcasses and even more hay coming into BC from Alberta. So what can we do to prevent this from happening? Education to increase awareness is our top priority, particularly around these human activities, import. Through workshops and information sessions, webinars, we're trying to build that awareness to reduce risk. Testing is also a really important preventative measure, because if we can catch it early, we'll have much higher likelihood of success in containing it. So early detection is key to catching it before CWD spreads and before it gets into the environment. Early detection has also been demonstrated to improve success of management actions applied. If the disease is allowed to go undetected and take hold of a population, there's little that we can do to stop it. So yeah, that early detection is really key. Lastly, BC has implemented some regulations under the Wildlife Act to reduce risk as well. One of those regulations is what we call these, cervid import regulation. So in 2022, BC amended this regulation that prohibits the import of cervid parts. We expanded the list of prohibited parts and it now includes bones. So you can only bring deboned meat as well as cleaned antlers and skull plate and clean hide back to BC. The idea here is that we're trying to limit the amount of waste that is going to be that is getting into the environment. So even bringing back quarters, for example, those need to be processed, and any of the material that is generated as waste can then transfer CWD to the environment. Our thinking is that if it's going in the freezer or it's going on the wall, it may still contain CWD, but it's going to be a much lower risk of getting into the environment. We also have a regulation that prohibits the use of cervid biological material like scents, and so this is also in effect. We've also had to implement mandatory testing for deer in the highest risk zones along the BC-Alberta border and the BC-Montana border. This is to provide us with the information that we need to confirm disease status. So mandatory testing is a condition of the hunting license, and it now includes both white-tailed deer and mule deer, and wildlife management units were 1 through 4.8 and 423 through 425. We've also expanded some freezer locations throughout the province, but particularly in the Kootenays to accommodate increased samples. So testing here is mandatory. Testing in all other parts of the province are voluntary, but highly encouraged. So more on our testing program. We are testing all species of cervid, of the cervid family, so deer, elk, moose, and caribou. Harvested animals make up about 80% of the samples submitted, but we're also keen to receive roadkill samples or any other opportunistic samples. Trappers have been really helpful in accessing roadkill that they're picking up for bait, so that's been great. The whole head of the animal is not required. Certainly the top of the head or the antlers, you want to remove the antlers and the skull plate, that's fine. All we really need are tissues at the base of the skull and at the back of the throat. For deer, submission of just the low jaw is actually great if you want to do a European mount. Lots of hunters are just turning in the low jaw. And we have freezers located throughout the province. We're adding new locations all the time, so direct people to our website to check out those freezer locations when you're out for a hunt. If you are in an area that does not have a freezer, then we're really interested in hearing from you about potential new locations so we can fill some of those gaps. Here are the tissues that we're actually using for the testing. So we collect a specific lymph node at the back of the throat on all species. This is the main sample that we need. For deer, we also collect tonsils at the back of the throat. For elk, moose, and caribou, we still require a part of the brainstem called the obex. and that is at the very base of the skull, near the joint of the base of the skull in that first vertebrae. So for this sample, we do still require part of the skull, but again, you can take the top of the skull off. We're encouraging hunters, if you don't want to turn in the whole head, bring it to one of our wildlife offices and we can pull the tissues, or you can watch a video online to learn how to pull the tissues yourself and then just submit the tissues. That's great too. Yeah, so that provides us with everything we need for testing, and then we send those samples off to a lab. Here are the results from the 2022 season. So we had just over 1,200 heads submitted. The vast majority of those came out of the mandatory units in the Kootenays. The number of samples tested in the mandatory units is providing us good confidence in disease status. We can report that if the disease was present in the population in 1% of animals or more, we would have detected a case. So that's where we say, you know, disease not present under 1% disease prevalence. So that's pretty good. Within those, last year it would have been 9 management units. However, the management units just adjacent to those mandatory units had very few, in some cases, no samples at all. So overall, the rest of the Kootenay region and the rest of the province, we have very little confidence in disease status because we're just not testing enough animals. At these numbers that we tested last year, we're only testing an estimate of about 4% of the cervids that are harvested in BC in 2022, based on harvest estimates. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. The target for 2023 is 3,000 samples. So I'm shooting to double that number. And this is where hunters can play a role in supporting that science-based management by providing those samples so that we can have the data to fully understand the situation and make some smart decisions around it. What hunter samples provide and the data that they provide is so important now for early detection, but it's also really important for when we have a CWD positive case, so that we can understand the situation and make some good decisions on how to manage it. For effective science-based management, we need to know what species and demographics of the population are impacted, so we can target animals that are most likely to be infected. I want to also address the issue with turnaround time on results. This has been an issue, and we appreciate that it's really frustrating that it takes so long to get results back in some cases. We have made some changes to our system this year. We hope that improvements with our testing, our submission and testing system is going to help to expedite results. Good news is we can now confirm that we're going to have a BC-based lab for CWD testing next year, which is something that we've been pushing for over 10 years. And our partners with the BC Ministry of Agriculture are setting up a platform so that we will, for the first time, be able to do CWD testing within BC. So hopefully that will also help to expedite the results back to hunters. So inevitably, BC is going to detect CWD sometime soon. And when that happens, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to eradicate the disease completely, but the goal is going to be to minimize negative impacts as much as possible. So we'll do this through actions to reduce transmission and spread. And longer term, we'll try to maintain low disease prevalence or low number of animals infected, something like less than 5% of animals infected, like sustained over time, maintained over time. We have learned so much through the experience of other places that have been dealing with disease for the last couple of decades. Back in the early 2000s, they just didn't have the tools or the knowledge that we have now. So some mistakes were made, and we can now learn from them. So in the early 2000s, when CWD was first detected in Alberta wildlife, the theory of the day was to hit it hard and stop it in its tracks. So Alberta applied what we now refer to as a scorched earth approach with large-scale culls. Did it slow the disease in those first 3 years? Yes, it did. Shown here with the orange bars on the graph. But it was so unpopular and it lost public and political support. So any effort to control CWD was shut down after 3 years, and the disease was able to take hold of those populations, get into the environment, and what we saw over the next 10 years was this exponential growth in cases, which is the classic CWD curve in the absence of management intervention. Now, in some mule deer populations, they are reporting over 55% of animals infected with CWD in eastern Alberta. Around the same time, Wisconsin and Illinois detected their first cases. They were both able to detect the disease early when it was still below 1% disease prevalence in the population, but the two took very different approaches. Wisconsin took a similar approach to Alberta with the large-scale culls, and also lost public support. After a few years, after a few years of that management, when that management was then halted, we see this, again, exponential increase in cases. Illinois, however, took a different approach. They took the time to understand the situation, and they sat down and really, in a meaningful way, worked with the hunting community from the start. So once they had the facts of the situation, they understood sort of the animals that were most likely to be infected. They were able to target harvest management to remove just those animals. Rather than removing every animal from the landscape, you can zero in on animals most likely to be infected. They also applied some really small scale targeted, sharpshooters removals that were based on the data that they collected, when they identified a cluster of cases or something like that. But this is a real success story. After 20 years, Illinois is now still reporting a disease prevalence of less than 3% animals infected, compared to Alberta's 55%. And so this is what success looks like. So with these examples to learn from, and with the recommendations from experts, we know that effective management requires three things: early detection before the disease has an opportunity to take hold, decisions that are based on science using data collected from samples, often hunter collected samples, and collaboration with hunters. In BC, in the BC plan, we do outline some early response actions that we plan to take following that first CWD positive case. Again, focusing on the goal of reducing transmission and spread. We would first define an initial response area, about 10 kilometers radius around that initial case. And within that response area, we would apply some emergency orders under the Animal Health Act. So things like carcass transport restrictions, disposal requirements, also likely to be mandatory testing of cervids. That might include roadkill even. So this targeted sampling would then provide the information that we need to understand the situation, and we can make smarter decisions around what the next steps are going to look like. So we'll then move towards a management plan. With our advisory committee and our working groups, our collaborative team in BC, we will determine what the objectives that we want to see for wildlife and what the facts of the CWD outbreak are. We can then review different options for management and consider what kind of approach we want to take to achieve those objectives. There's going to be a range. But these will likely include things like adapting harvest strategies, what some other places have done are applied a special hunt, maybe some additional tags in certain areas. If high-risk situations are identified, like a cluster of cases or maybe an outbreak in an urban deer populations, we may consider additional removals, but they would be very targeted and small scale. So our initial response plan is outlined in the broader BC CWD plan, and this is available on the CWD website. In the meantime, let's focus on prevention, yeah? So if we're going to stay ahead of CWD, we collectively need to increase awareness to reduce risk. You can help by taking this information from this presentation or other resources and helping us to spread the word. We're always looking for opportunities to set up new freezer locations and to do outreach. So if you're part of a club or community organization, we would love to come and do an info session or a workshop. We're doing a lot of sampling workshops and training hunters how to collect samples right now. So if there's any ideas like that, we welcome those opportunities. And I also hope that everyone has a very successful hunting season. And if you do harvest a deer, elk, or moose, or caribou, then please, from anywhere in the province, then please consider submitting that for testing. So that's it. We have an amazing team in BC, so I just wanted to acknowledge all of our partners that are helping us with this effort. Also want to special thanks to the BC Wildlife Federation and all the hunters that support us and contribute to the program in one way or another. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Cait. That was great. On to the questions. I've got two right out of the gates. First one says, hi, Cait, would the prions potentially be present in antler material? And if so, is there risk from imported dog antler chews?
Yeah, technically, let me just figure out how to unshare my screen here. Yes, so I can't figure, oh, here, stop sharing. Yes, technically, the CWD prions can be present in any part of the animal, including antlers, antler sheds, anything. We know that the prions will be more highly concentrated in organs and the central nervous system tissue, but it really can be present anywhere. So we don't fully understand sort of how much prion material it takes to, infected animal, contaminated environment, but we know that the risk exists. There's some level of risk for sure.
Thank you. Question number 2, if an animal is harvested in Alberta, so this is going to be kind of a regulatory question, but maybe you're up to speed on those. If an animal is harvested in Alberta, can a piece of hide remain on the animal for identification? Also, if a head is brought into BC, can the skull be skinned out?
Okay, so yes, because you still need to maintain evidence of sex and species. I've been told that the way to do it is you can skin an animal, you can debone it, you can still leave a little section of hide, or on the hind quarter, the genitalia attached to that piece of meat to satisfy the evidence of sex and species. In terms of heads coming in, we only want the antlers and skull plate cleaned. If an entire head is coming in, it would need to be, processed, taxidermied in Alberta or wherever the origin jurisdiction is. So, because we don't want any of that tissue material coming back. So I think the question specifically was asking about, can it be skinned out? Sure, but what we're trying to avoid is any additional tissue. So right now, just the antlers and skull plate are permitted.
Awesome, thanks. And if anybody is ever unsure, best place to go is to call the Conservation Officer Service, and they'll give you the interpretation of the regs. Are fallow deer farms in BC a concern for CWD outbreaks?
We suspect that fallow deer could be susceptible. We've done sort of a risk assessment on the fallow deer farms, and there's not a lot of animals. And fallow deer are kind of strange because they don't tend to pick up CWD kind of in a natural environment. They seem to be kind of almost, I don't know, not as susceptible as other cervids. So the risk is there. We work with the Ministry of Agriculture and, provide information and encourage through the Ministry of Agriculture that, any fallow deer that dies on the premises is tested for CWD just to be certain. But in general, it is considered a low risk just because the low number of animals in BC, and because fallow deer are just kind of weird and don't tend to get it as easily.
Okay. This one may, well, we'll see if you're up to speed. Where there is biosolid application in the area, is that possibly related to the source of prions?
Sorry, what was the first part of the question?
Biosolid application.
I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, okay, well, we'll have to defer that question and see if we can get someone who's in the loop. It's there's some controversial stuff around biosolids. There's a bunch in the Merritt area. Anyways, it's yeah.
Okay.
We'll put that one to you and see if we can come up with something. Another question, where did this disease come from?
Yeah, good question. We don't know exactly where it originated from, where it came from. We know that the first documented cases came out of a research facility a couple of research facilities in Colorado and Wyoming in the 1960s. And they had no idea that this was CWD then, but it was later, like decades later, determined that that was actually what it was. But by the time they'd figured out what it was, it had spilled into the wild population and gotten to farms and had moved around in North America a fair bit by that time. So we don't really know exactly where it came from, but those are the first recorded cases were out of that research facility in Colorado and Wyoming in the 60s.
Thanks. Has CWD been detected in any predators, i.e. wolves?
No, there has been some research with predators, and so far, the results of that indicate that predators that consume an infected carcass, they will ingest that infected material and the CWD prions. Those prions will move through their digestive system and come out the other end still infectious. So they play a role in moving it around the landscape, but the predators don't themselves become infected. They're more just kind of carriers of the disease. We don't fully understand all of it, but the kind of preliminary research, they've looked at coyotes and crows, and for sure for those, that's what we've seen is they don't become infected, but they still kind of are part of the system because they have the ability to spread it around the landscape.
Awesome. Okay, I got a couple of simultaneous questions here. How are populations in captive environments being handled?
Okay, so I assume that's like when a population is determined to be affected or there's positive cases in a captive population. It varies in different areas, and even in Canada that's changed since I've been involved. There used to be a full depopulation of farms in Canada if there was a positive case. I don't believe they're doing that anymore. I think it's kind of on a case-by-case basis. They do an investigation on the premises and work with the producer to determine kind of what the course is, but I don't think depopulation is required. Some places in the States, they may still be doing that. The reason behind that is, in the prairies and some places in the States, when CWD was moving around the farms, and they really cracked down and they said, okay, positive farm, everything is depopulated. But then, that premises was void of animals, and then they would introduce new animals, and then those animals were becoming infected. And it was because the prions were in the soil and they couldn't decontaminate that environment. And so then it was, I guess the thinking was this depopulation isn't actually working, and it's being, it's really hitting the producers hard. And so they've kind of pulled back on that a little bit because it's already in the environment. So.
Thanks. Will moose and elk be added to the list of mandatory testing?
Not right now. I don't see a rationale for that happening currently. We're certainly interested in testing moose and elk because they can be positive. They can contract the disease, but the vast majority of cases are still in deer species, and depending on the ecosystem, sometimes it's mule deer, sometimes it's whitetail, sometimes it's both. But deer in general, that's where we see most of the cases, and so it's the most it's a target species for testing to be able to pick up that first case of CWD. You want to focus on the species that's most likely to be infected.
Do you get any samples from the highway maintenance crews from roadkill?
In some areas we do. I would love to have way more. Up in the Peace region, the highway crews and the municipality have been awesome. We've been getting lots of roadkills from them. Most of the other highway or like roadkill samples are coming from trappers that are picking up roadkill for bait, and then they're submitting the heads for us. But working with MOTI and the different highway crews, trying to find a system to make that work, but it hasn't so far resulted in too many samples.
Awesome. One more on here. How do you determine which animals are most susceptible?
Oh, good question. Lots of research right now. I mean, there's different, it's kind of a complicated answer, but there's different strains of CWD that will impact different species differently. Because it's a prion, the body doesn't have an immune response. It doesn't recognize it as something different, like it would a virus or a bacteria. And so it's, if you have a stressed animal, or if, a weak animal, or like a weak immune system, the CWD doesn't discriminate with those animals. So really any animal can be susceptible. But yeah, they've done some work looking at caribou to see if there's some, hopefully, with the conservation concerns around caribou, maybe they're not as susceptible, but it doesn't seem to be the case. So yeah, it's not an area that we fully understand, but yeah, I think like I said, it doesn't discriminate. Pretty much everything is going to be susceptible.
Yeah, and I think they did have a CWD outbreak when reindeer in Europe too, right? So yeah. Okay. What's the turnaround time for testing for results typically?
Yeah, last year was our worst year ever for turnaround time, and that was very frustrating. And it was a result because we've always sent our samples to the University of Saskatchewan, the lab there, for testing, and with all the programs in Canada in particular, but everywhere, are really expanding. And so we had a pretty good system with Saskatchewan for a while. And then we kind of just kept getting bumped because they were expanding their program and other programs were utilizing the Saskatchewan lab. And so it was pretty bad. I think, it was, worst case scenario was maybe 2 or 3 months for a result to get back, which is terrible. So, I mean, it's consistent, in other places. People in Alberta are waiting for the same kind of turnaround. But yeah, we've adjusted our process in BC for this year. And of course, we haven't really had an opportunity to test it yet. But we're hopeful that by doing a bit more of the prep on this side before it's submitted to the lab, we'll be able to turn around a result closer to 4 weeks this fall. And then, yeah, so 4 weeks, it's still not great, but that's from the time of us submitting it to the lab too, right? So the sooner we get to that sample, the sooner it's going to get into the lab. And that's another reason why, if hunters are willing to pull their own tissues, or if we do more of these kind of sampling blitzes and sampling workshops in communities, then we can get on them faster and get them off to the lab. When we have a lab in BC next year, I'm hopeful that that's going to reduce that turnaround time even more. I mean, I don't know exactly, but I'm like 3 weeks, maybe 2 or 3 weeks after we submit them to the lab. So that's kind of our target.
Awesome. Thanks. Okay. Maybe we'll deal. I'll add on to this question. Are there concerns for CWD prions flowing into BC via rivers from Alberta or Montana? And maybe just elaborate on where the highest risk is. I mean, it's already kind of identified in the regs, but do you want to share that information?
Yeah, okay. So that's a really interesting question, and I don't know the answer. We know that prions can be present in water, bodies of water, and animals can ingest the prions by drinking the water. I don't know that there's been any studies. We don't have tools to test environmental samples, right? So on a outside of our research kind of setting, or research like a lab setting, it would be really hard to get a handle on that. But I mean, potentially it could be, particularly in Alberta, where it's been, so established in that environment, and in the soil, and any kind of runoff into water courses potentially could be moving that. I personally, if I had to guess, risk to BC, that's probably not the highest risk of what we want to be focusing on. But I mean, the potential could be there. We just don't really understand that pathway.
Thanks. Is there any testing being done at the deer and elk farms in Alberta?
Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure any animal coming off of those farms before it enters the food chain is definitely going to be tested. I imagine animals that die, unknown causes on premises, will be tested. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency has a voluntary herd certification program, and so farms can participate in that and then get this, like, depending on how much testing they do, they get kind of these levels of certification, which give them more flexibility for moving animals around and things like that. So I think there's a range, like different farms are probably doing different levels of testing, but testing is occurring for sure, definitely before it enters the food chain. I'm like this most recent case in northern Alberta, I'm not sure. We don't have the information yet of how that came to light, but presumably it was through their routine testing.
Thanks. How does a hunter handle the game animal and butcher the animal not knowing if it is infected?
Okay, that's another great question. So I mean, we just advise kind of general safe handling of anytime you're handling a game animal. So things like wearing gloves, cleaning your instruments and surfaces after whether it's field dressing or butchering an animal, at home. For CWD specifically, we know that a 40% bleach solution on metal tools can help to deactivate the prion. It doesn't work for like wooden or concrete surfaces, but disinfecting your tools in bleach is helpful. And yeah, just keeping a clean space, gloves, limiting handling of the central nervous system tissue and the organs where we know prions are going to be most highly concentrated. And if you're field dressing or butchering multiple animals, just to keep all of that sort of separate and package animals separately. So if one animal did come back positive, then they're not all kind of lumped together, that you handled them separately. And so the animal that was not positive is clean.
Great. Is it possible to reduce disease rates when they get prevalence is very high, like in Alberta?
No. The short answer is no. Unfortunately, and I work really closely with the Alberta program, and once it gets to that level, you're not going to see cases go down until you start to see number of animals on the landscape decline,
Thanks.
unfortunately. Yeah.
Any idea where the testing lab will be located?
For BC, it's going to be our BC Agriculture Lab in Abbotsford.
Great. Related to possible natural vectors and earlier questions, given that prions remain in the soil for extended periods, is there evidence that wetted, damped areas harbor the prions for any longer periods of time than drier? Is UV exposure tied to longevities in the soil? So I guess what are the variables around that? And then a question around waterfowl using agricultural lands where deer might be foraging as also another vector, airborne vector.
Okay. So to address the first one, there are different characteristics of soil that will change kind of how the prions will remain in the environment. So these prions will actually bind really strongly to certain soil types, and they say clay is one. So if there's a high clay composition in the soil, the prions will bind really tightly to that, and so they will remain sort of available at the surface, if that makes sense, right? Because they're bound to soil. In other soil types, the prions can kind of like wash away almost and get kind of drained through soil because they're not bound to these like larger molecules. So so we know that the soil type can affect that, and then sort of secondarily kind of water washing through can also transport prions through the system. The second question was, can you repeat the second question about waterfowl, was it?
I sure can. So it was around essentially as an airborne vector. So what about the soil? What about UV exposure? And then what about waterfowl, using agricultural lands where they could be picking it up and then transporting it from one side of the continent to the other, I guess, or one end of the continent to the other.
Totally. There's potential for that for sure. We know through crows, like we were talking about scavengers, predators before, crows can move it around just through their digestive system, right? So, presumably any kind of animal could pick it up, even if it was in their system internally or externally, like on a surface. There's a potential picking it up from water and moving it around. We don't fully understand how that works, and this hasn't really been documented. It's kind of just a theoretical possibility or risk right now.
Okay, well, you're well under your time. You're well under your time, so nice work. And thank you again for coming on. It'll be great to have you on again next year. We're all keeping our fingers crossed, I guess.
Me too.
But it's kind of, it's knocking on our door in Alberta and in Montana. And so, I'm glad that you're on the file, and hopefully we can kind of plan and prepare as much as possible. So thank you again, Cait. Appreciate everybody who attended. Just a quick heads up, our next webinar is September 26th. So Philippe has got us working hard. We got another one a week from now. It's called Forest Policy, Ecosystem Health and Restoration, Reversing the Damage Around BC's Beleaguered Forest Ecosystems. It'll be Jeff Warner out of UNBC, who will be talking about forest policy impacts, ecosystem health and restoration. I'm sure he'll be spending a bunch of time on moose too, because he's written a few papers and has been working on his PhD around that. So that's the next one. So there's one plug for the next webinar. There's another plug for the folks in Region 8 in the Okanagan, who now have a competition for bringing in your heads to help support Cait's sampling. So they're saying that anyone who submits a head will be entered in a draw for cool prizes. I don't know what cool prizes are. I've asked them, but they're not giving me a good answer. They're saying binos, gift certificates are top of list. The drop-offs are on the CWD site, I believe, and any surveys submitted in 2023 will be drawn early 2024. So if you're in Region 8 and you harvest an animal that's eligible, please turn in the head to the sampling stations in Region 8 or anywhere for that matter, and we'll enter you for a draw. So thanks, Cait.
Right on.
Thanks, Philippe, who's been doing all the tech work. Thanks for everyone who attended. I really find these questions interesting and people have put a lot of thought into them. So we appreciate that. And hopefully we'll see you all a week from now.
Right on.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.